Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in to today's show. We have a good slate of segments ahead for you guys. We're going to continue with some betting odds in different sports, updating you guys on those. We'll start off with the Heisman odds, and then we'll follow it up with the Stanley Cup odds as well as we head into the 24-25 NHL offseason and seeing what trades and offseason rumors could be changing the landscape there. And we'll also continue our IDP player profiles with some very exciting players at various positions. So, before we begin, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to both the show and the network. It is a huge support to all involved. We also do tend to receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link gsmc.cloud. It's again a huge support, both of me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole, so anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Also, if you have any burning questions, comments, or concerns about anything related to the show, you can leave them there, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's jump right into what should be an exciting show for you guys today. Let's start off in the world of college football. It makes its triumphant return to the show. I love talking college football, one of my favorite sports, but there's been a shakeup in the Heisman race, and that is what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at how each of the top 10 in terms of betting odds can be the new Heisman, and who can be rising up the ladder and who can be falling down the ladder, and who ultimately, in this very crowded race, this has never been as crowded as it's been in ages, is going to eventually come out on top. So let's jump right into this segment. And we will start off at number 10 with a guy who is a very interesting case, a redshirt sophomore out of Texas A&M. New head coach, but if he's to be the face of this Texas A&M Aggie squad, he really needs to prove his prowess. Last year, we saw some flashes of what he could be. Threw for a little under 1,000 yards in the limited game time he had, and that is Connor Wegman. He, out of all those different Texas A&M quarterbacks that they've had over the years, Haynes King, Zach Calzada, he seems to be the guy who is willing to stick around, develop, even though Jimbo Fisher era did not work out. Mike Elko comes in, and we saw what he all did with Riley Leonard over there at Duke, so it should be a new horizon for the Texas A&M Aggies. However, I don't think they have the personnel, especially on the offensive side of the football, to really keep up with some of the SEC's elite. The only high-profile receiver I can think about right now from them is Moose Muhammad. He's never been in that wide receiver one role. They had a lot of production leave. Evan Stewart obviously went to Oregon. We'll talk about them a little bit later. But I really think in order for Connor Wegman to succeed, he does need at least someone who has a sense of what this offense is all about. I just think that right now, 10 seems a little bit higher for him, and at plus 2,200, those are very long odds, so don't think that I would want to place all my eggs in one basket with Connor Wegman. But I still think he has a lot of potential, and he could be the best quarterback to lead Texas A&M into a new era. And coming in at number 9, definitely is a guy who's going to get a lot of hype. Had quite the journey in his college career, moving from an FCS school to Washington State, and now ending up at Miami. We have Cam Ward. At plus 2,200, I actually like Cam Ward's long odds. This is the best receiver room he's ever had. He has Xavier Restrepo, 1,000-yard receiver last year. Jacoby George showed flashes last year of what he could be, a breakout year, and then they add Houston wide receiver transfer and Samuel Brown. I think that Cam Ward has a lot of upside. We'll have to see how he translates to a more competitive conference in the ACC. 3,735 yards for him, 25 touchdowns, and 7 picks last year, his last at Washington State. He adds that experience. I believe this is his 5th year, and I think that right now, Cam Ward, when I'm looking at all these odds in the same range, he seems like one of the more intriguing options with longer odds who could vault up this kind of leaderboard for the Heisman as the season goes on, because I do believe that Cam Ward definitely has the kind of dark horse potential that can be realized once he fully settles into Miami, and he has the wide receiver room to do it, unlike a Connor Wegman. Coming in at number 8 is a very interesting proposition here, because this guy does not have as much experience as some of the others on this list, and that is Garrett Nussmeier out of LSU. Looks like he's going to be the number 1 option for them going forward. But at plus 2,200, much in the same range as Cam Ward and Connor Wegman, I don't really like his value because I don't know too much about his game. And he's replacing Jaden Daniels. And also, the receiver room is not what Jaden Daniels had either. He does have the experience in Kyron Lacey and CJ Daniels, who's a grad student and redshirt senior respectively. But I'm looking at Garrett Nussmeier, and the only real game that I see was a good one in the Rely Quest Bowl, where he had 395 yards. But it didn't really show me a full season's worth of what Garrett Nussmeier can bring to the table at LSU. And I really don't think that LSU needs to rush into things with him, but I certainly feel as if Garrett Nussmeier is one of those guys who is being picked on blind faith, and mainly because LSU does not necessarily have the hardest SEC schedule out of any of the teams that we're going to talk about later in the segment. They definitely have an easier slate. They do have the experience for him, but right now I feel like LSU needs to realize that they're not going to have swing for the fences seasons every single year. They are one of the more transitional teams who could be primed for a breakout season, but they need to realize that right now they don't necessarily have the assets to maintain a certain level of dominance and good play in order to win the SEC and challenge for a playoff spot. But right now, I think that 8 is a little bit too high, much like with Connor Wegman for Garrett Nussmeier. Coming in number 7 is definitely a guy who's gotten a lot of hype, deservedly so, after his latter half of last season, his first season as the Alabama Crimson Tide starter. Jalen Milroe. I really love what this kid did in the latter half of the season, because at the beginning of the season, there were a lot of question marks surrounding what Nick Saban would do at the quarterback position for Alabama. Jalen Milroe didn't really separate himself from guys like Ty Simpson and Dylan Lonergan, and it was really a kind of a process of getting him up to speed with the whole way they wanted to play football. But in the latter half of the season, he got going. He really shined. He led many statistics in the latter half of the season, and ultimately Alabama got a deserved CFP spot. And so at plus 1,600, I really like him as another guy whose odds should just go up a little bit more. And looking at the Alabama receiver room, they did lose a lot of production. They lose Bond and Nye Black. They add Jeremy Bernard from new coach Kalen DeBoer's University of Washington team, who didn't really have a chance in that crowded wide receiver room over there. And they have Kobe Prentice still, who has shown flashes of brilliance, but at his best is just a very decent wide receiver too. And so I'm really looking at Jalen Milroe as a make it or break it kind of year for him, because I really like what Alabama did with him last year, but this year seems a bit different because there's going to be a lot more pressure on getting it right for new head coach Kalen DeBoer. I really like what he's doing. He's pushing all the right buttons, but it has to translate onto the field. And I think Jalen Milroe has a good shot at truly becoming even better due to what Kalen DeBoer teaches him as well. His offense could really pop if all the pieces fit together. Coming in number 6, another guy who is really a question mark at plus 1,600. Another guy who should have a bit longer odds in this race. Nico Yamalieva, another kind of redshirt freshman guy who comes into Tennessee. A lot of question marks surrounding him. He does have the profile of being a former 5-star. They talk about him highly, but I just haven't seen it yet on the field. He's much like Garrett Nussmeier, a little bit like Connor Wegman, but Connor Wegman is more proven. I just don't see why Nico Yamalieva has the 6th best odds in this race when there are guys who have proven themselves Maybe it's because most of those guys have transferred, but Nico Yamalieva certainly feels like I need to see more of him. He did have a decent bowl game where he showed his dual threat abilities, but I need something to hold on to see. In like at least a 3 to 5 game sample of Nico Yamalieva and his play to truly grasp where he stands in this Heisman race. And that's really all I can say about him at the moment. He has all the intangibles. He has the 5-star rating, but he needs to put it all together. Coming in at number 5, though, was probably my favorite guy on this board. I was a big fan of the Big 12 when Texas was still there. They were my team. And this guy really was a nuisance for just his calm and composure and ability to deliver when called upon. Will Howard transfers to Ohio State, immediately steps into that QB1 position at plus 1,600 again. I really like Will Howard because he's not really going to be asked to do too much. If you look at his receiver room, it might be the best in college football, even with the absence of Marvin Harrison Jr. as he's now gone to the NFL. I still have Emeka Egbuka, who has the potential to be a very solid wide receiver one, fantastic route running abilities. You have Jeremiah Smith, who's been turning heads in spring practice, the freshman. And you have Carnell Tate, another freshman. There's a lot of excitement surrounding this team. And Will Howard, all he had to do was just be a steady presence. Kind of much like what Kyle McCord was last year. Being a guy who can deliver the football to his playmakers without, ruining the structure of the team. That's all that needs to be said. So at plus 1,600, I really like the value here for Will Howard in terms of betting odds. Coming in number 4 is a guy who's kind of been going under the radar, in my humble opinion, in the SEC. And Jackson Dart, with all the talk about Carson Beck versus Quinn Ewers and stuff of that nature, people forget about Jackson Dart over at Ole Miss. He obviously did have a fantastic running back last year in Quinton Judkins, and they formed a dynamic duo in the backfield. But this year, I think that Jackson Dart's true talent to be realized. He threw for over 3,300 yards last year. I still think at plus 1,500, Jackson Dart could be in the reckoning to at least be in the top 3 for the Heisman odds. He has a solid receiving core in Trey McCann, Antoine Wells, Jordan Watkins add that experience and the 1,000-yard experience, most importantly. So Jackson Dart is no shortage of targets. He really is one of those guys who shouldn't be forgotten about in the SEC. But, of course, he's behind these two guys named Beck and Ewers, and we have to talk about them. Coming in at number 3 is, of course, Quinn Ewers, moving to the SEC with Texas. I really liked the way he improved last year. Over 3,400 yards for him, 22 touchdowns, 6 picks. He really elevated his game, but the question mark this year is, will those transfer portal additions that Texas made truly replace guys like Latavion Sanders, guys like Jonathan Brooks, guys like A.D. Mitchell, guys like Xavier Worthy, guys like and so on and so forth, Jordan Whittington? Who will step up to replace them? They added Isaiah Bond and Amari Niblack. I thought that was very nice pickups. They add Silas Bolden from Oregon State, Matthew Golden from Houston, and top it all out, they have 5-star recruit Ryan Wingo waiting in the wings. So it's all set up very nicely for Quinn Ewers. But I think that this season is all about his consistency. I want to see him be more consistent and comfortable in this offensive system. And so I'm looking ahead to see what Quinn Ewers is going to do for this Texas offense now they're in the SEC. And he has stiff competition because at number 2 is Carson Beck. Carson Beck, a metronomic presence for Georgia, kind of in that Stetson Bennett mold, but a little bit more consistent, more of a pocket passer, in my humble opinion. But at plus 800, he has very good odds. 3,941 yards last year. His 86 QBR was 5th in the nation. Also led the nation in completion percentage. So just that level of consistency. However, when his wide receiver room is stripped bare, I do want to see what he does with lesser talent. Because gone is guys like Brock Bowers, Ladd McConkey, even a guy like Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint. And now comes in Dominic Lovett and Ra Thomas, these two unproven guys. They add Benjamin Urosek from Stanford in their tight end room. They already have Oscar Delp, but I do think that Carson Beck may look a bit more vulnerable, but he still should be that guy who's calm and composed in the pocket and will elevate this team. But there's a new number one in town, a new sheriff in town at the number one spot in terms of these Heisman rankings. He's not in the SEC. He's not in the Big 12. He's in the Big 10, a new Big 10 team, and a new quarterback for this Big 10 team, replacing the great Bo Nix in Dillon Gabriel. When all is said and done, this guy could be one of, if not the best, college football quarterbacks of the past 2 decades. 10,000 yards throughout his illustrious career, whether it be at UCF or Oklahoma. At plus 750, I really like Dillon Gabriel, especially now that he's not on one of my rival teams. 3,660 yards last year, 30 TDs in his final season at Oklahoma. Really a huge part of why the Venables era was semi-successful. But Dillon Gabriel, when all is said and done, should be the kind of guy you're talking about at the top of Heisman odds. He goes into an Oregon room that has Tez Johnson, very exciting player. They have Evan Stewart, the transfer in from Texas A&M, was talking about. I really like what they're building over in Oregon. And Dan Lanning is the kind of coach that will get the best out of Dillon Gabriel. And I really like him in what should be his final year in college football to go out into the sunset, potentially as a Heisman Trophy winner, because I think he deserves it. It's hard to say as a Texas fan because of what he did with Oklahoma, but I truly believe that he's a special kid. That should just about do it for this segment of today's show. Coming next, we do our first IDP player profile of the day with one of the most fearsome defensive ends, definitely the most tattooed defensive ends in the league. If you've been watching, we're just got things like receiver and seeing this guy's face pop up, you'll definitely know who it is. We'll be back to talk about him after the break on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you liked that rather long segment about the updated Heisman odds. I love college football and love presenting anything that I can about college football to you guys. So I hope you enjoyed it. But we are continuing with our IDP player profile series with a guy who I really like as a menacing presence and one of the more physical defenses in the league. And he's definitely one of the more powerful figures when I think about this team and their profile as a defense. And that, of course, is Mr. Max Crosby. Now, Max Crosby is one of those guys who, when you look at the Las Vegas Raiders, is the leader, at the very least, of their defensive unit. He strikes fear into opposing offenses, opposing offensive linemen, just because of his physicality and grit. And I really, really love what I see of him every year. He just constantly improves and gets better. He got to this point just by finding different ways to incorporate different moves into his game. And I really love what he's going to do in this new look Raiders defense under a head coach who's going to preach the defensive identity for the Las Vegas Raiders. Let's go over his fantasy stats throughout his entire career and last year especially. Throughout his entire career, Max Crosby has accumulated 671.2 fantasy points. His best season was actually last year, where he accumulated a fantastic 176.5 fantasy points, 55 solo tackles, 23 tackles for loss, which led the league, 15 sacks, and 2 passes defended for good measure. Incredible stats last season for a player of Max Crosby's caliber. And what I love about the profile of the Las Vegas Raiders defense for next year is they truly are going to emphasize grit and power more than any other team in not just the AFC, but in the entire NFL. I really love the move they made, adding Christian Wilkins in that D tackle position to eat up more blockers, help the interior, especially in a 4-3 defense that's going to ask a lot of Max Crosby in terms of creating space for not only himself but for others. He's going to be on that right side, Malcolm Kuntz on the left, the guy who is more agile, who can get to the backfield in many different ways. And that's what I really love about Max Crosby, because not only is he going to contribute in terms of the production he does for himself, but I really think this opens up a lot more of what the Raiders needed. I'm thinking about Christian Wilkins' former team. I think it opens up a lot more for what this Raiders defense, who's constantly improving, is going to look like. I think that their strength is their front seven. Obviously, you have the more experienced front four, and you have a guy in Robert Spillane, who actually Antonio Pierce did say he wanted to build the defense around, who is just a menace, just not the biggest, strongest player, but a guy who's going to always be in and around the play. And I just really like the profile of this team. I will continue to say it, because I think what Antonio Pierce has here is a culture he can really get behind. I think that if this team didn't have players like Max Crosby or guys like Robert Spillane and now Christian Wilkins, it wouldn't be as comfortable of a transition from Josh McDaniels, who was more like straight as an arrow, to Antonio Pierce, who brings the fire that the Las Vegas Raiders desperately needed in their organization at their head coaching position. That being said, I think that the best way to get the best out of this defense is sticking with that 4-3. I think you get the interior presence, you get Max Crosby creating for others, it allows for Robert Spillane to come more into plays, and I really like how, Antonio Pierce will be willing to bring it out. If there are any caveats to the way Max Crosby plays, I think it is, in a sense, more limiting than people think. Because in a 4-3 defense, if you're the right end, your job, at least in the front seven, in terms of the front seven, is to truly create space for every single player in your front seven to work. Max Crosby can do that. But he's also a guy who's more suited to rushing after the quarterback than creating that space, which is a good thing, because in terms of IDP, you want the stats, you want this idea that this player you're invested in can be the guy who will lead your squad. And right now, when I look at Max Crosby, I see a leader. I see a player who wants to take that next step. I see a player who really is the heartbeat of that defensive line. But when it's all said and done, in terms of physicality, I think that Max Crosby can sometimes get overconfident in just himself. That's why I think the Raiders realized it, acquired Christian Wilkins to kind of alleviate the pressure. But I want to see Max Crosby, in a weird way, allow himself to realize that he can be a producer for this defense still. We can do it in many different ways that don't necessarily rely on him just rushing the quarterback. Because the variance in the Las Vegas Raiders defense is there. It just has to be realized. And when you consider the fact that Las Vegas never really got going on the defensive end in the Josh McDaniels era, and Max Crosby was still one of the best defensive players in the league during that time, you start to think that maybe Max Crosby needs to focus more on the team building aspect of the defense rather than the individual aspect of it, because that's the mentality that I'm thinking of when I look at the Raiders. Even when watching something like receiver, when it's focused on Devontae Adams, even though, it's more of an organizational thing. The frustrations that were there under Josh McDaniels were evident. And even though it focused on Devontae Adams, you could tell that the culture of the team just was not meshing together. Maybe it was different on the defensive end, but who knows? I just think that the mentality that needs to be realized is that every single person on the defense is physical. Every single person on the defense deserves to have a season like Max Crosby. Not just Max Crosby. Max Crosby will always be the face of this defense, point blank. But if Antonio Pierce wants to stick to his word and say, hey, guys like Robert Spillane deserve a lot of credit for being on this defense and being what they are for this defense, then Max Crosby definitely does need to understand that his role as that right end means a lot more to this Las Vegas Raiders team than meets the eye. In terms of fantasy, he's as good as gold. I don't think any notion of skepticism should seep into your mind due to the fact that I'm sitting here telling you Max Crosby should take a back seat. He's still going to have the stats. He's still going to have the stats as every solid defensive player should do. But I feel that the Las Vegas Raiders defense is also going to step up around him. Because I don't really have a choice. The system that they're in really suits their defensive identity. And if you ask me, this mentality definitely is becoming of a lot of these players. I think that they're willing to channel the frustration of the Josh McDaniels years into a system that really allows everyone to have a say. Max Crosby, at the center of it all, will be the guy who's like, hey, Antonio Pierce wants this from us. We have to hold ourselves accountable. Which is the words of a leader. Which is the words of someone who himself knows he can be better. And that betterment stems from connectedness to the team. I think him and Christian Wilkins are going to find that their styles suit each other so perfectly. Because Christian Wilkins is immediately going to slot into that interior defensive line, eat up some of the blockers, be physical, open up spaces for everyone. And Max Crosby as well won't necessarily have to work as hard on the right end to open up spaces for other players. And so it's all going to be about alleviating certain pressures on the weaknesses of this defense, which are starting to become fewer and fewer, in my humble opinion, for this Las Vegas Raiders team. When all is said and done, do I believe that Max Crosby will be a lesser player because of the new additions? Heck no. I think he's going to be someone who steps into the role that Antonio Pierce presents him as a tone setter, much like other defensive ends I've talked about already on this show. He's going to realize that the help will stem from the identity these players create. And ultimately, I think this defense will be much better for it when all is said and done, because Max Crosby is willing to invest his time in the culture of this team, the mentality of this team, the physicality of what makes the Las Vegas Raiders tick. Because Antonio Pierce is a great head coaching hire for this Las Vegas Raiders squad. But in order for him to be really special, he needs that one true tone setter on each level of the ball to say, this is what I want your identity to be, so be it. And that guy will forever be Max Crosby. That will just about do it for this segment. Hope you guys enjoyed that. But we are going back to some odds for our next segment, looking at the updated Stanley Cup odds. Who sits atop those betting odds? We'll be right back to discuss those after the break on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, and welcome back again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we dive into our Stanley Cup odds segment for today's show, I do want to remind you guys yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. But coming up on today's show, we have another bit of a betting odds segment. We are going back to the world of hockey as we look at the updated Stanley Cup odds for the 2024-25 NHL season. What a fantastic year we had in hockey this year. Fantastic, dramatic Stanley Cup final where both teams looked like they had long stretches of where they were dominant. Ultimately, the Florida Panthers were your 2023-24 NHL champion. But this year, there's going to be a lot of new teams in the reckoning again, and a lot of excitement surrounding these top teams I have here on my list that I really believe will step forward and make names for themselves. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with the number one favorite in terms of betting odds, the Edmonton Oilers. The Edmonton Oilers, really tough way to lose the Stanley Cup final after coming back from the 3-0 deficit to force that Game 7. But when all is said and done, they still have the components there. McDavid's not going anywhere for a little bit, so is Draisaitl. So this offseason is just mainly about retaining all the pieces you like going forward, and making sure that no one you really desperately think you need on this team in order to make that similar run leaves. And immediately, they got right down to it. They re-signed Adam Henrique, who was a very important player in terms of his play in both the Western Conference semifinal and the Stanley Cup final. He added that extra level of depth at the forward position, the lines, and they also re-signed Matthias Janmark. Fantastic postseason as well. Really crucial to the way Chris Knobloch was able to play certain lines, find certain groupings and combinations that worked for him in different series. And so, ultimately, that was all the Edmonton Oilers really needed to do. They also bought out Jeff Skinner's contract from Buffalo. I really like that addition. Adds depth and physicality yet again to the forward groups. And it's all about that life, because they have the setup that they need in order to make another run. They have the power play. They now have the depth of the defensive positions. And they also have the youth they have. Guys like Dylan Holloway are going to get more playing time. Guys like Philip Broberg are going to get more playing time. So I really like the direction the Oilers are going to take, even when they bid adieu to McDavid and Draisaitl. So I think the Edmonton Oilers at plus 800 are a good bet to return to the Stanley Cup Finals and this time win it. But then again, right behind them are the team that beat them in the Stanley Cup final. The Panthers at plus 900. They, similar to the Edmonton Oilers, I forgot to mention about the Edmonton Oilers, they did fire the legendary GM, Ken Holland. When all is said and done, he's going to be a Hall of Famer. And finding a replacement for him is going to be difficult. But ultimately, I think the Oilers right now just edge the Panthers in terms of just retaining the core that they already have. The Panthers are similar to what Edmonton is doing, are also retaining their core. The most important aspect of it was retaining and tying down one of my favorite fantasy players of this past year, my favorite players in the NHL right now, the top goal scorer from last season, Sam Reinhart. Because you look at the Florida Panthers, the way they won last year because they were a team. They were a team that was connected to their identity. Every single player understood their role, no matter which line they were on, no matter what grouping they were on, no matter which power play unit they were on. They always found a way. And Sam Reinhart was the face of that because he was the guy, no matter what. Whether he was in the face-off, in the power play, whether stepping back in the defensive zone and helping his team there, Sam Reinhart was here, there, and everywhere. And it's truly translated to one of his best seasons in a Florida Panthers jersey. I think that when all is said and done, when you take away a guy like Sam Reinhart from the Florida Panthers, you take away a large part of the kind of player who they want to build around, the profile that they want to build around. So it was very paramount that Sam Reinhart stayed. They also re-signed Anton Lundell, a very sneaky defenseman that I really like. Had kind of a rocky postseason, kind of stepped it up in the Stanley Cup final, but ultimately he's a very integral part of their defensive structure as well. But overall, when I look at the Oilers and Panthers, these are the two teams that really have the least question marks in the league. Maybe if you look at the Oilers, it's the goaltending, and maybe if you look at the Panthers, it's kind of, maintaining and sustaining their excellence. But when all is said and done, I think these two teams are the best in respective conferences and deserve to be at the top of these betting odds. Looking at the teams behind them, starting off the Dallas Stars with 10-1 odds, I think Dallas was just this close to being the Western Conference Finals representative. And in my opinion, they were just one player away from being that Western Conference Finals representative. And that player was Rupe Hintz, because when Rupe Hintz was healthy, you saw the impact he had if you're a hockey fan in the Western Conference semifinals. That partnership between him and Jason Robertson is something to behold. And I really like the Dallas Stars. Whenever I talk about the Dallas Stars, I talk about the melding together of both youth and experience. When I look at what the Florida Panthers, the Dallas Stars are capable of, is the fact that they can develop the prospects they have, whether it be through the draft or young players they acquire, and mix them into the experience they already have. Rupe Hintz, one of the more experienced players. Jason Robertson, a little less so. Wyatt Johnston, Thomas Harley, also very youthful. And they themselves are becoming the best players on this squad. When you combine them with guys like Miro Heiskanen and Pavelski on the back end, a lot of experience, a lot of ice time together, you get one of the most well-rounded squads in the Western Conference. A team that's just going to continue to grow prospects. Look out for the prospect they drafted in this draft, Emil Hemming. I really like his upside. When all is said and done, I think Dallas could sneak into the top two in terms of betting odds, mainly because a lot of people are underestimating what injuries did to this team. If every single player was healthy in the Dallas Stars, they could have won the Stanley Cup this year. But it is what it is, and perhaps that's why odds makers aren't willing to put them in that Oilers-Panthers duopoly and see them at that highly. But coming in at number 4, kind of a surprise team, but if you're a tri-state area person, you will definitely like to hear that. Maybe not if you're in the metropolitan area of the tri-state area. It's the New Jersey Devils coming in at 11-1 odds. And look, I actually see it. I think that the New Jersey Devils, in the offseason, looked at their weaknesses. Their defense needed a little bit of shoring up behind leader Dougie Hamilton. And they needed a goaltender who didn't have to constantly rotate in and out. They've struggled at the goaltender position for many years. So they said, okay, these are the departments we need to fix. And I really like the move they made. They got Jacob Markstrom, a solid goaltender, was in the kind of Vezina Trophy reckoning a couple of years ago. I had him on my fantasy hockey squad, and honestly, he carried me. So, solid goaltender in between the sticks that they can rely upon for a lot more games than a guy like Mackenzie Blackwood or Akira Schmid. And then, you bring in guys like Brett Pesca and Brendan Dillon from the Jets, who can really shore up a defense that's probably the weakest part of this team. But when I look at the forward depth, I definitely say this team can contend for the Cup. Jack Hughes, Nico Hischier, Jesper Bratt, Yegor Sharangovich. I really love the structure of the building. And they got rid, most importantly, of Lindy Ruff, who's a guy who I don't necessarily believe had the culture that the New Jersey Devils needed at that moment in time. I think they needed someone who was able to bring in that extra level of production for them and someone who fit into the comfortability of the squad. At the end of the day, they didn't necessarily do that. And so I feel like now is the time for the Jersey Devils to pounce in the Eastern Conference because they now have the depth, they diagnosed the problems, fixed them, and going into the season they should be rejuvenated, ready to go. And then rounding up the top 5 is the Colorado Avalanche. I'm going to shout they're this low as well because they still have one of the best, if not the best, cores in the NHL with Nathan McKinnon, Mikko Rantanen, Cale Makar, and Gabe Landeskog. I think that ultimately, when this group is healthy, they are beautiful to watch. And it's annoying sometimes because they're in the same conference as my Edmonton Oilers. But when all is said and done, this team should always be in the reckoning for the Stanley Cup. Because, as we saw just 2 short years ago, when everyone is clicking for them, they are a machine that cannot be slowed. And it all just relies upon how the health of this team impacts them. And so, I really believe that at the end of the day, when you're looking at this team, they're definitely going to be forcing their way into the duopoly in terms of betting odds. But right now, this top 5 definitely very diverse. I like the Devils being there. I think they're a team that should be in the reckoning always. But at the end of the day, I really like this setup here in terms of the Stanley Cup. Coming next, we continue yet again with our IDP player profile, this time talking about a corner who, due to injury concerns and the injury bug following him constantly, hasn't really had a chance to show what he can be at his best. We'll get into why I think that after the break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available every...
Hello everyone and welcome back again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys are enjoying the show. We are in the home stretch and we have yet another fantasy player profile in the IDP League for you guys at the cornerback position this time. A guy who, like I said before the break, has been constantly hit by the injury bug, especially last year where he had flashes of brilliance when he came back because he was not fully fit, didn't really get the chance to shine in a new defense for him. And that, of course, is Jalen Ramsey, a guy who I know can produce at the best level. He has insane coverage skills. When he's on his game, he's one of the hardest cornerbacks to beat in the league. but he just needs a long run of health for himself. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into what makes Jalen Ramsey so controversial and pivotal in terms of how you view IDP corners. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 663.7 fantasy points. His best season was in 2022 with 129.7 fantasy points at the corner position, still with the LA Rams, I believe. Last year, he had 5 passes defended, did not play as much, obviously, only played about 5 or so games at the latter half of the season. But overall, in this secondary for the Miami Dolphins that's constantly improving, that I really like, in a 3-4 defense that's really going to focus a lot on the back end of things, the freedom that the back end players have, is really going to show me what Jalen Ramsey's made of. And it feels funny considering his years with the Rams, where he's one of, if not the best corners in the league, highly feared by all. But I think that the Miami Dolphins defense is going to become much more open. What I mean by this is that when I look at the pieces they have, they definitely are very strong in their linebacker core. But when I look at their front 3 to 4, they lose a guy like Christian Wilkins, who opens a lot of stuff up for that line. And they add an aging Calais Campbell. I'm starting to think that maybe this squad doesn't necessarily have what it takes in terms of the line depth to really threaten teams. I don't see someone in that front 4 because I really do like the linebackers, but they were also hurt. Let's not forget about that last year. So, when all is said and done, I'm thinking, how is this Miami secondary going to come into play? Because that's where a lot of the depth that they've been adding can prove themselves. And Jalen Ramsey's going to be the leader of that corner group. In a 3-4 defense, when the corners have a lot of freedom, I think the best way to suit them is man-to-man coverage, because that's Jalen Ramsey's forte. If you play zone, he's still solid, but I think that the most beneficial way to get the most out of these secondary players, I really do like Jordan Poyer and Javon Holland. They're becoming very solid, whether they're playing the safety position or the corner position. I know Kader Kohu is still integrating himself in the squad. Had a couple slip-ups. Mainly it's going to be the guy in man-to-man that opposing quarterbacks look at on that secondary to throw the ball against. But when all said and done, I think that this secondary really is going to be one of the more physical aspects of this team. Because in the early stretches of the season, you're not only going to be working back in Jalen Phillips, who had a breakout season before his Achilles tear, but might not be at full fitness. You have to work back Bradley Chubb as well. And those are your best front 7 players. So, a lot of the time, more often than not, the ball is going to be thrown against the Miami Dolphins, not run. And when you need that physicality from your corners who can press their man, who can jam their man at the line, that's where a guy like Jalen Ramsey comes into play. When, I think about players who are effective in terms of their culture and what they bring, Jalen Ramsey fits the bill for the Dolphins. I think that, when I think of solid corners. They have to be good in every area and aspect that they're asked of, whether in zone or man. They also have to have that edge to them that their secondary mates will understand and follow. And they also have to have had experience in many different schemes to understand that. And Jalen Ramsey has that. As a Ram, he was asked to be a lot more physical and asked to wear a lot more hats in that defense because, they were much more dominant and much more respected of him. Not saying that the Dolphins are not going to be dominant because they still have the pieces there to maintain their modicum of success that they had last year. But I think that injuries really hindered what they were building. And when you look at the core strength of this team, every single unit outside the defensive line, which is now weakened due to the loss of Christian Wilkins, was hit by injuries. And so, how is that going to affect how the Dolphins play coming out of the gate? Because they really want to build on what they had in the defense last year. When they were on the field, there was magic. But there was only about 2 to 3 games where all of Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips, and Jalen Ramsey were on the field. That has to change because they have the scheme. They have the attitude. They're now starting to build an offensive identity surrounding what they know best. But if injuries are going to be what holds them back, then that's really scary to think about because one small thing can really lead to the detriment of the whole here. And Jalen Ramsey is a huge part of that because if you take away one of Bradley Chubb or Jalen Phillips, you might be okay. Because linebacker depth is a little bit more easy to cover up, in my humble opinion, than secondary depth. If you take away Jalen Ramsey, yes, you have Javon Holland and Jordan Poyer, but they haven't had the edge and experience that Jalen Ramsey had coming into the league where he was dominant. And you need that vocal leader as well in the secondary when you're, a younger defense trying to figure things out. And Jalen Ramsey might not be that now because of the fact he has been beset by injuries. He hasn't had time to gel into a newer system. But when all is said and done, Jalen Ramsey, for just his presence alone, brings a lot of mentality to this young team. I really like that they're beginning to become predicated on their secondary play. I don't necessarily think it's sustainable, but when you have that depth at the secondary spots, you have more freedom. And with a guy like Jalen Ramsey, if he remains healthy, gives you even more time and ability for these players to gel together. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's all you can ask from a leader, no matter whether he's hurt or not. Now, my one true caveat is if teams throw the ball more on the Dolphins. That's my only caveat. Because there definitely is going to be a lot of pressure on the secondary early on. Because when I look at the Dolphins front three, like I said, they don't have much potency. I think Calais Campbell's at the latter half of his career. He's just playing it out, seeing what he can do. So there's not going to be a lot of pressure up front outside of Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips. So teams are going to take advantage of that. And Jalen Ramsey's going to have to be ready. And if he's not fully fit, then the secondary has less chance of thriving than if he's not fully fit. Then the walls will come crashing down. Because right now, the Miami Dolphins are an experiment. A lot could go right and a lot could go wrong. And Jalen Ramsey's the center of that. Because lose one of Bradley Chubb or Jalen Phillips, But if you lose Jalen Ramsey in your secondary, that's huge. Because he's the connective tissue that holds that group together. And ultimately, the fantasy player who is going to have a lot of stock if you're looking at the Dolphins. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming up to close out the show, we have another defensive line player profile with a guy who just got a big money contract and should be feeling good about going into this offseason. You don't want to miss it to close out the show on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hello everyone and welcome back to today's last segment on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And the guy who we're about to talk about just got a big money contract, 4 years, one of the highest paid defensive tackles in the league, deservedly so, and he really is the spark on this defense, and that, of course, is Chris Jones. When all is said and done, and we look back at the Chiefs' defenses of the Pat Mahomes era, you're not necessarily going to remember that many players because you're going to remember Patrick Mahomes on the offense. But if there's one player who's always going to be a constant from this era for the Chiefs, it has to be Chris Jones. And when they sat down at the negotiating table, they knew they could not lose him because of his importance to the squad. And what the Chiefs are building here is something that centers around versatility. And when I look at Chris Jones, I see the most versatile defensive tackle in the league because he can play anywhere on the line. He'll still be damaged. He's a big physical presence that you always have to account for, no matter what. And he's just going to take up a lot of space and really muddles what your offense can do. So that's why it was so integral to the offseason plans of the Chiefs to maintain Chris Jones and retain him for years to come, because he is such a pivotal part of what makes this underrated defense tick. And so let's jump right into his stats throughout his career. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 795.1 fantasy points. His best season was 2018, where he had 152. 20 solo tackles last year, 13 tackles for loss, 11 sacks, and 4 passes defended for him. And so, when I look at Chris Jones, I see a player who, on a defensive line that has a mixture of versatility, physicality, and grit. I see someone who is really sustaining the fact that the Chiefs' defense is going to hit you at all levels. No matter who's playing where, the Chiefs are always going to be someone who are going to consistently get pressure. That's a testament to C-Spec Nono as well. He always comes up with special schemes for his players to integrate. But Chris Jones certainly really helps him scheme what he wants to do. Because when you look at this defensive line for the Chiefs, I see guys like Mike Dana and Derek Gennady, who I really like as depth pieces, but are not necessarily people you recognize as being on a high-level defensive line. But then I look at Chris Jones and George Karlaftis, and I think this is the perfect pairing. Because Chris Jones can come off, say, the right end, George Karlaftis the left. Maybe they can interchange that a little bit. But when all is said and done, Chris Jones is more of an interior lineman. And in a 4-3 scheme where you can rely more upon stunts and sims and pressures, Chris Jones can play anywhere along that line and be comfortable with knowing he has a guy on the edge who is athletic and gets to the quarterback in his own way, and he has players in the middle who he can rely upon to just offer that sense of physicality, to jam blockers, and really get him going as well. Because when all is said and done, Chris Jones is not just someone who eats up blockers. He's someone who can get to the quarterback as well. And so, what I really love about the upside of a player like Chris Jones is no matter what, he's going to get production. Because Steve Spagnuolo realizes that in order for him to get more ambitious with his schemes and his defensive fits, Chris Jones is going to be someone who can get most of that production. I actually really think he's going to help Karlaftis, who I'm going to talk about a little bit more later in the week when I do his IDP player profile. Because you look at that tandem, Chris Jones is definitely the more prototypical nose tackle kind of guy. He's the bigger presence who's going to take up a lot more space. George Karlaftis is definitely a big guy. He's around 270, 280, but he fits more of the mold of the athletic guy who can place on the outside, who can create space for himself. Which honestly takes a lot of pressure off Mike Dana and Derek Gennady because they don't necessarily have to do too much. Because if George Karlaftis is creating for himself, coming up with different ways to rush the quarterback, and Chris Jones is eating up the blockers, that actually takes a lot of pressure off Mike Dana and Derek Gennady. It also opens up the space for them as well. Because when you have two dominant players on your defensive front, and you're more of the role players who kind of fit in as you see fit, then that really adds up to this culture of every man for themselves, what I think Steve Spagnuolo really likes. And it might be a caveat to say it that way, but I see a lot of individual talent on this Chiefs roster. I see a lot of players who fill in fits for other players as well. In certain deficiencies, some players are better at other players, and in certain areas, some players are worse. For better or worse, when I look at the Chiefs squad, that's the best of what I can say about Chris Jones because he fills a lot of those deficiencies. Mike Dan and Derek and Nani might not be the guys who can create after jamming blockers. So Chris Jones kind of fills that void. They might not be known for their pass rush moves. George Karlaftis fills that role. And so I think that when the Chiefs knew Chris Jones was wanting a huge money contract, they were willing to offer it to him right away because they knew he was going to be the biggest role. They knew it was going to require the most attention. And when all is said and done, Chris Jones represents a defense that is greater than the sum of its parts. You have high-profile players. You have guys like L'Jarius Sneed on the back end. You have Karlaftis, like I said. But you have more of these role player guys who are just trying to fit in. And with Chris Jones, it just makes it a whole ton easier. Because you can do so many things with him. His size alone is something that is very rare in a player of his caliber. His versatility alone is something rare for a player of his caliber. And when you combine that with a defense that makes do with what they have, that's good enough for Steve Spagnuolo and the Kansas City Chiefs. But that should just about do it for today's show. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you yet again for tuning into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I have been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning into this great show. We'll be back tomorrow with yet another edition of the show. Back better than ever. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in.